Okay, welcome everyone back to our podcast of Talking Data with Joel and Mike. And for our third successive time in our three-part series that we're running at the moment, we have our special guest, Nigel Harris. So welcome again, Nigel. If this is your first visit to our podcast, Nigel is the ex-CEO of Mocatta Foundation and now runs his own consulting business in the not-for-profit sector to mostly boards and executives. And we have my co-panelist, Michael Mocatta, who, once again, if those are new to the podcast, is our Strategic Solutions Director at Microsoft and has a vast experience in all things data for many years. And Mike and I have such in-depth conversations day in, day out that I think this is a great opportunity for us to bring those conversations to others out there who are interested. So jumping into our third topic. So today we're going to talk about show us the numbers, gut feel is so 1999. So what do we mean by that? Really, it's about data-driven investment decisions. And Nigel Harris has had a vast amount of experience in this space, especially seen the highs and lows of what's done well and what's not done so well. So we'll tackle a lot of these issues today. But for context, to tie into our three-part series, we started off in our first part of really the opening conversation of what we hear in board sessions is we're a charity, however, we can't afford to do it, which is just like a real mindset topic that we dove into. Then that led us into this really more immediate topic that's prevalent widely today around AI. And when we tackled the question of, is it a toy for the tech crew, or is it more a fundraiser's next best friend? And for those who missed that session, we invite you to go back and listen to that because there was lots of interesting debate that went on there. So coming back to our third part of this series of show us the numbers, we're going to talk about four things. We're going to talk about like why evidence does win. We're going to then explore around how do we explain to boards in a dashboard and what's the design there. So we've got some interesting four-dimensional metrics to share with you there. Then really we're going to go into the success and failure stories. That's obviously where I'm sure we'll have lots to talk about there. And then finally, to wrap up, I think to tie this together, governance around a lot of the data we're doing is critical, and both Mark and Nigel will be able to share lots of really honest and clear discussions in that area. So my first question, so I'm going to hand it over to Nigel. So tell us, Nigel, a time where data really saved you from an expensive hunch, and whether that's, yeah.
Well, I think it's probably not one time. It's actually setting up a continuum of times where you avoid that. And the thing that really sticks in my mind, just before around governance and boards and reporting, for me, the thing that I keep coming back to as a recurring point of reference is creating board reports that were anchored in a long tail of data, particularly financial information, but also other relevant information that I used in a way to continue to remind the board I reported to of where we had been as an organisation. So as to reference where we were at any given time, and then to reference where we're heading into the future. So I guess the expensive hunches question, or expensive hunch question, was really any number of expensive hunches, which would otherwise be based on just looking at what's in front of you in the moment without understanding the reference against which it should be seen. So if I think back to how we were framing strategy and how we were framing business decisions, that overarching anchoring of reporting against a long tail of history and a view of the future was one of the most important tools we used from a management to board context, because it actually created context for decision making. and avoided, by implication, a lot more the potential of random decisions, if you like, or decisions that weren't necessarily informed by the full picture.
Yeah. I mean, and probably can add to that, like even just this week from two sort of mainstream charities, how like from a Microsoft's perspective, what we hear and things around decisions around like there might be a real focus on just acquiring new donors, no matter the quality of them, and obviously you hear a lot about this in conferences, but like a really good specific example was that they're really interested in the number of new donors and not so much the value of the donors. So we had like clear segments where certain audiences would achieve half the amount of donors, but twice the amount of gift value. And so you go, well, hang on, isn't that better? Like, isn't that actually the lifetime value and ROI many times greater? So it, yeah, I just those sort of feedback loops. You go, are they really making these decisions by data or is it by hunch?
And if I could just jump into that, I think there's a couple of interesting points you make, or many in fact, but one is the mirroring of those examples against the macro market data, where we're seeing fewer donors giving more. So that in itself, I think, is an interesting reference. But the other question that really I think continues to challenge this sector is getting lost in quantitative data, whether it be financial data or non-financial data, at the expense of qualitative data. So to the very point in saying, well, yes, okay, we might have a whole lot of donors, but what's actually going on in that donor cohort? What's the story that is behind it? How do we understand that experience? Because we're not transacting in a singular sense here. Philanthropy and fundraising practice is a very, very different process from just simply transacting. So I think that's where that qual and quant focus really plays out. And then to understand exactly what story is being told through that, rather than getting lost in assumptions that the things you want to hear.
Yeah, yeah, and I'd say I'd admit sometimes we're at risk of being sometimes too in the weeds with certain fundraising programs and not thinking about that. Yeah, the wider focus.
Yeah.
So Mike, I guess in this case for yourself, like if you had to like pitch, like in our world, it's really pitching to execs and boards around the case for like having a really data centered decision making program. What would you see as like your key statement?
Well, firstly, it's about identifying the right metrics, right? I think that's important because what I see in inexperienced teams and businesses and so on, where they are, similar to what Nigel sort of referred to, and that is they're just reporting numbers for the sake of reporting numbers, right? And those numbers aren't meaningful, and they're not looking at the real story behind the numbers, or trying to find what is the real story and the evidence that underpins that story. Because sometimes people just want they, whether they're time pressed or whether they're inexperienced or whether they're just going through the motions, and that's probably the latter is probably the real culprit here, that people just go through the motions of producing reports and not really thinking about what's in that report and how is that report going to be used. I mean, in a historical life of mine, there was a big push by the organization I was working for, is to reduce the number of reports but increase the quality of those reports, and that's important. Because the other issue I see within businesses is that some manager comes along and says, "Oh, I need a report for this," or "I need a report for that," and obviously they go to their teams and they get that report, but the message or the story behind that report gets lost over time. That report just gets continuously created. New management come along and or new individuals come along and nobody understands what the report is about, right? And what's the benefit of that report? And I think that's where a lot of businesses get lost. So key to me is identifying the right metrics, and then as an organization going about to ensure that those metrics and the data that's underpinning those metrics is sound and true, right? Because that's another issue businesses have, where they cobble together data from all over the place in multiple silos, and they don't realize that sometimes that they're cobbling in to their spreadsheets data that's completely out of date, out of whack, all that sort of stuff.
And that's where it's a real blessing and curse, I think, in equal measure. I mean, the blessing is, as you touched on as your opening comments, John, in the absence of data, we really just drawn into hunches and guesses and just a series of wild assumptions about what we think we might be going on. And certainly in this business of serving social purpose, not-for-profits, and moving drilling into particularly managing fundraising programs, there is a lot of speculation, and a lot of it's informed in, I'll call it fuzzy logic, without so much logic and just fuzzy. So that's the blessing. But the curse is exactly to what you just touched on, Mike. What informs your interpretation and your analysis of the information that you're being presented, both in a quantitative sense and a qualitative sense? And I think that's where that light landing is a massive risk. It doesn't often get challenged anywhere near to the extent that it should or may otherwise be. So that's that balancing effect of saying, yep, okay, good to have data, we can make some decisions around that. But there is a significant trap in making assumptions about the data that you are seeing, which is just as powerless as not using data.
There's this famous quote from a data scientist over in the States, where he said, if you torture the data long enough, it will confess to anything.
And yes, it's you can get some great stitch-ups, I think, in terms of what the data is alleged to have confessed to. So yeah, absolutely right. I thought you were going to refer to lies, damn lies, and statistics for a moment.
Yeah,
and,
there's
another
a
one as
few
well,
out there, but this
Yep.
particular one was always a favourite of mine because it's sort of simple and sort of very true to the fact that you can if you torture data, you can sort of make it say anything you want.
And isn't 73% of statistics made up?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, one of the really simple examples that jumps out to my mind, and it uses a lot, is this notion of interpreting profit and loss statements for information well beyond that which they actually contain. So what I've seen in any number of organisations is this wise quantification around interpreting a profit and loss as something that tells you a lot about the relationship between revenue and expenditure in a particular moment in time, whereas in fact the expenditure is based around something that will happen in the future and the revenue is based on something that happened in the past. So we're actually bringing two different tribes of information together and trying to unite them as one. And it's really dangerous. But yet I hear and have witnessed and experienced this time after time when some very wise and challenging words are uttered around the relationship between just something simple as a profit and loss statement. And my view is it's never intended to tell us the information that we think we draw from it.
Yeah, I agree with that, Nigel, definitely, because obviously there's a number of us would have studied university all about accounting and profit and loss to some degree, right? And one of the first things you're taught in that particular field is around the profit, right? And I think it's a tool that has been overused and used incorrectly in terms of how it is run, to run a business, right? Obviously, it's important for a business to be profitable. So it's important to understand where the expenses are. But you're right. There's a lot of, there's this perception that certain correlations between expenses and profit, right? And they don't necessarily, exist in the real world sense.
In fundraising cost ratios are probably one of the best examples you can get of something that's fundamentally abject nonsense. So when people position a cost ratio as some evidence of either efficiency or performance or something else, I would say in every case it's nonsense, because you're bringing information that really has little relationship to itself, but B, you're making a series of assumptions about a range of other factors that have influenced outcomes and performance, which just have no reading in looking at that instrument. So yes, P&L is important, cash flow is important, all those things are fundamental to business, but perhaps the challenge we have in the sector is we've let that happen without really prosecuting more cogent and complete measurement frameworks that actually create a different narrative, a different understanding, a different interpretation of what information we're seeing. So, I think we're very much the authors of our own problem in this sector in terms of those measurement questions.
Is this a good segue to the 4-dimensional dashboard, Nigel?
I'm glad you asked.
Because I remember when you first shared some of those principles. Actually, it really the bit that stood out for me was the time dimension, the idea that actually many things can happen over many years, and there's certain programs, for example, that are more leading programs that will actually be offset with other programs further down the track. So that was one thing that stood out, but I'd love to hear or share with the audience more about your experiences with that.
Well, I think the challenge and wrestling with the challenge of simplistic financial metrics, particularly those that are P&L based, for me at least, has really led to that curiosity to say, well, what are those denominators that help us understand a more complete measurement? I'm talking particularly in a fundraising context here. So just to be clear, this is particularly relevant, I think, in that across a range of activities which are really designed to create and sustain and evolve relationships related to people's philanthropy. So, typically we look at cost metrics or financial metrics in the moment. And so I would say the first thing from a finance perspective is, finance is a terribly important metric. You wouldn't be without it, but just looking at it as a single moment in time is problematic. So you want to measure finance, the movement of finance, not the moment of finance. But in order to understand what's happening there, you've got to understand the different programs that you bring to market and how they work in singularity, but also in a systems-based approach. So how they work in harmony with each other, because one will feed another. And the best example I can give there is in gifts and wills or bequests. More often than not, the results that materialize in that sort of program activity will be forged in other program work of engagement, which will rarely, if ever, credit the outcome that is seen in that program. The third area that I talked to is measuring relationships. So here again, we're measuring the progression and the evolution of relationships over time so that we understand that propensity view, lifetime value, those other longer term perspectives of where things are traveling over time, because that's the nature of the business that we're in a fundraising context. And the fourth, and again, I would argue the most critical denominator, is actually time. So to have a time-based metric, that is to say, everything is viewed over a window of time, which is why in my opening remarks I talked to that board reporting framework that had a long tail and pointed to a future. Without understanding how things are moving over time, both in a planning sense and activity sense, I'm not sure you really understand where you are. And it's a bit like going on a hike or something like that. If you haven't got a sense of where you've begun and where you're moving to, wherever you are in the moment is irrelevant, because you're fundamentally lost. And I think that's how we do a lot of reporting. So that's those four metrics of finance, relationships, programs, and time, or denominators, I should say, for me would be the framework that you would look at.
And And it also points to that time aspect, making decisions that span over longer periods of time as well. It often I know the catch cry for most execs and teams is quarterly or annual sort of budgeting cycles, and that's as far as they're looking.
Well, here's a stiff challenge. If the best you can do is to look at survival, if you don't have time to give time, that is to say, have a long view around your strategy and let the evolution of work materialize because you've too focused on survival now, then perhaps don't survive. Perhaps you're not in sufficient shape to actually do the work in serving the purpose that you need to serve. And maybe other organisations could or should do that instead, that are better calibrated to do the job they're geared to do.
Yeah. So don't do the crime unless you're prepared to do the time. Yeah.
Totally.
Maybe that's not a good
No.
Mike, have you got thoughts around that framework or how?
Yeah, look, time is obviously that fourth dimension, which is time, is the a critical component to it, right? Whether you're looking back or looking forward, in both directions to get a better understanding where you are, and where you need to be, right? In relation to your cause and your objective and stuff like that. And a lot of businesses, both not for profit and in the commercial sector, fall into the trap of only looking a very short distance in the future, and not really planning effectively to guide that business in a longer time period, right? Because there's always going to be ups and downs and humps and challenges along the way. Obviously, you've got to allow for those. However, I just find that a lot of Australian businesses fall into too short a time cycle, and therefore they don't make the investments.
Mm.
It's interesting as you talk about Australian businesses. I mean, I'm aware this is perhaps a very, very general concept here, but I'll use it anyway, is that a more normal platform, for example, in a Japanese way of doing business is to think in that 100-year span. And so this idea of thinking longitudinally in many generations is, I think, an anathema in business framework we're familiar with, but certainly seems to work. The business, the leadership author and speaker Jim Collins talks to this when he talks about measuring for the quarter century, and his emphasis is very much on that long view. And so there's a lot in that, I think, that we probably need to dip into.
Yeah, because there's, like, statistically, 60% of Australian businesses fail in the first 3 years, which is crazy when you think about it. It's almost like there's a mindset that it's too short-sighted, and they're almost setting themselves up to fail in terms of business practices.
And I think there's another challenge here, particularly in the not-for-profit sector, where our fundamental reason for being is about serving purpose. And the nature of our ownership, if you will, is not that you own a business or have a group of shareholders in a business. You're actually serving a very different set of stakeholders. And so this idea of custodianship or stewardship from a leadership perspective is absolutely critical, where board members, executives take on something from those who came before and hand on something to those who come after, but in this sense of continuum. And I think that this is true in many other businesses as well, family businesses in particular, but I think this is absolutely critical in a not-for-profit sector sense, which again is where time really plays its hand.
Is this where, like with the 4 dimensions, like it's a mixture of quantitative and qualitative information, which often is a challenge to data, especially around the qualitative side, and I guess just to quickly share an experience, like when we're starting to do more and more holistic measurements in this space, this is where AI starts to play a bit of a part, or a helping hand in this role, because now for the first time you can start to link together more around that sort of positioning and messaging of the cause, with like timing of what's going on in the outer world, with then the more specific execution of those programs, is I guess, yeah, bringing together quantitative and qualitative. How does that sort of, your experiences there?
From my perspective, I think one of the challenges when we talk about data is to assume we're just talking about quantitative data, numbers. But of course, that's not the case. And that may be a slightly simplistic view, but it seems to me at least that that's the gravitational pull. Let's go to the numbers. But my concern is if you don't understand what sits behind the numbers, what's the story that informs them, what story do the numbers tell in terms of a future position, how do we interpret that? So we're moving into, again, this quantitative view of non-financial information, so numbers other than dollars, but also what's that qualitative narrative that sits underneath the numbers that help us understand where they came from and where they're going to take us into the future. And without that, I would say that we run a significant risk of just flying blind.
Yeah, because if you think about it, right, from a human perspective, we communicate in stories, and stories guide us and help us in terms of thinking. Numbers don't. Numbers obviously have their purpose, but if I gave you a whole heap of numbers around, say I've got a farm and I've got 10,000 sheep on it, right? That doesn't tell you anything in its real sense, right? If I suddenly tell you that I'm in drought, I've got no water, and I've got I'm going to be struggling to save this flock, then there's a different story behind that, right? So numbers in its raw terms don't necessarily give us the information that we actually seek, right? And that's why having the qualitative side of things, where it's descriptive, it's a story, there's thought that's gone into understanding the underlying information to provide advice and direction.
So an example in our sector right now, particularly in the fundraising context, is this focus on intergenerational wealth transfer and the opportunity that might be perceived to lie around gifts and wills. So it's that baby boomer cohort, but not exclusively, of course. So again, I'm now forgetting the number. It's at 7 trillion or something that's suggesting to be changing hands in the next 20 to 30 years. So we can look at that and get seduced into the idea that, isn't that fantastic? There's a whole lot of money that might go to charities. Well, maybe, but then we also understand there's another really important number, about 1% of estates have a charitable component. So that's an interesting number. But even then, sitting behind that, understanding why people would actually leave money in their will and under what circumstances, in what relationship context, and what other factors at play. So here we've moved away from the numerics to something that's far more germane to human experience. And yet I see, at least, maybe I'm overinterpreting this, but almost a seductive weave around, yes, look at this intergenerational wealth transfer and this move of money changing hands, but will it really go to charity, and what will happen there, and how will that benefit? And I'm not sure, unless we do a whole lot of other stuff really, really well in building relationships, that's actually where the bonanza sits for people.
Yeah, it's a good call, actually, because there are so many other external factors on that money, right? So, whether it's, for example, the money that some of this money that's been transferred across to a subsequent generation, a lot of those people in that subsequent generation can't afford to buy their own homes, right? and and so you've got this situation where you've got this, the baby boomers are transferring a lot of wealth, but they're potentially transferring a lot of wealth to subsequent generations that can't afford some of the luxury aspects of life in terms of a home and all these other different financial stabilities. Over in you talked about Japan. Over in Asia, there's this concept. In some places, there's this whole concept of generational debt, where they buy a home, and that home is passed on to their children, but they carry that debt all the way through. I'm looking at our economy and our where we're heading, and I think that's where we're probably heading. Where people will buy a home, and that home will become a part of the family, and that debt will possibly be paid off over multiple generations, or to before it's cleared. So. Yeah, I wonder how much of that wealth will actually be transferred to the not-for-profit industry, and I don't think it's just going to be as much as they would hope.
And again, it's that challenge in terms of that raw quantitative data, particularly the financial and non-financial, needing to then morph into an understanding of what needs to happen to create the meaningful long-term relationships with people who would even consider giving a gift to a different cause or organisations that serve purpose. And how is that manifested over time, and how is that legacy created? So there's a lot of checks and balances here. And again, I see a lot of high-level noise about it and a lot of seduction in terms of what we think the opportunity might be, but I'm not sure the boots on the ground experience is really referencing what needs to happen.
Yeah, and an interesting comment I had heard the other day, and which actually might be kind of counter to our discussion today, was that the view that sometimes data-driven decisions can be dangerous, and to the point where this is where some people, it's in their mind, they actually take on that. Maybe they've had a number of bad experiences. Maybe it was poor data quality or assumptions. So I guess the question maybe to us is that, can data stifle innovation, and how do we keep data feeding curiosity and keeping it alive?
Well, that's that blessing and curse reference I touched on earlier, I think, John, in terms of the curse is the assumptions that are built around interpretation of data and what you think it is telling you and how you understand it to be informed or constructive. So I think, there's a lot of quick sand to pits in and around data, and it doesn't necessarily, it's not a panacea. It's not so much accessing data, it's how you understand it, how you use it, how you apply it over time. So, I think there's a lot of ticking time bombs sitting in there.
Especially when the data is not being properly maintained, or there's other fabrications within the data to give you false positives or false negatives. There's all challenges there. But that to me, it just as any organisation needs to be aware that there are these challenges across the organisation, from a data collection and management and stuff like that, and then have the processes in place to at least try and mitigate that.
Which takes us into one of the really fundamental challenges, I think, that sits around this conversation and others we've been having in this series of podcasts, and that is, where is that leadership responsibility, and how is it manifested in what leaders need to do? And I'm talking about governance leaders and executive leaders in organisations, and probably the most critical part of that, in my observation, is curiosity. How do we actually exercise a level of curiosity to lean into what we're seeing, to not question it or challenge it from a skeptical foot base, but an interrogative understanding, just to help learn more and complete the knowledge set that then better informs that. Because if you do discover that, in fact, just exactly to your point, Mike, the data that you're looking at has been constructed in a very incomplete form, then it completely corrupts whatever decision making that you take from it. So for me, the big question that is a fundamental leadership challenge is, am I curious enough?
And perhaps data literacy flowing on from that, that would flow from being curious, I would have thought.
It poses a question, and again, I would come back to what certainly is accepted in governance circles as fundamental director responsibility, and that is, as an individual director, having sufficient knowledge of finances to exercise independent thinking and judgment. I mean, that's very clearly evidenced in case law. I would say that extends well beyond just finances, because there's a whole range of other activities that inform finances. So data is part of that set. So I think there is, this is the curiosity question, but I think even going beyond that, there is a fundamental obligation and legal duty to actually lean into things deeply.
Right, good. Well, we'll probably start to wrap up our podcast today. So maybe the final question to both of you on this topic is around like a Monday morning KPI. So what would your, off your top of your head, would be that sort of KPI that charities should be calculating on a Monday morning? So very, very quite specific. And I can sort of share like one. I actually asked this to one director of fundraising recently, and he just said, back to basics. It's new donors, retained donors, and ROI is the three metrics that's on his mind.
Look, for me, I think, particularly if it's a fundraising context, it's lifetime value of donors. So it's really taking up those metrics you've just mentioned and perhaps wrapping them up in a slightly more of a longer term view. What's that lifetime value that we're looking at in our donor cohort, and how is that moving from point of measurement to point of measurement?
Which would tie into your 4Ds framework as well. Yeah. And Michael?
Yeah, look, Monday morning, I was a not-for-profit. You know, all you
number of coffees
do at that, all you could do at that point is look at something. Possibly, well, there's, okay, you want to look at something going back in time, and you want to look at something going forward in time, right? So going back in time, what's your retention rate potentially, right? And then, in terms of going forward in time, what's going to be your outreach sort of program for the week, right? To try and find new people or new donors, right? So those are the, what sort of goal are you setting yourself, and what transpired the week before.
No, I think well, hopefully everyone's listening today is taken in the odd pearl of wisdom here and there. I mean, I guess actually I took in a few things today, and I think one of the things was keep it simple with data. I think the other one was like challenging the quality or assumptions in the data when you're doing this. The 4Ds, which is finance, programs, relationships, and time. So working across all those. And then the final one was, like, I thought it was interesting that popped out of our conversation. It's the stories that make them human, which popped out in my mind. So with that, we'll actually be publishing more material around this. So look out for some of the frameworks that we've been discussing today. But I'd like to once again thank our guest today, Nigel, for coming, and Michael. I guess any parting wisdom, but otherwise we'll hopefully see everyone next time.